Bene.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this conference entitled How to Save the Resources for Development. We are going to talk about this issue within the context of this year meeting's title. So the forces that move history are the same that make man happy. So we're going to talk about development within this context, in particular as far as Italy is concerned. And on the one hand, we're not going to talk about economy only, but still considering the weight of economy in relation to this topic. Development, and in particular development in Italy, are major issues and probably are the most important issues for the future of our country, not only from an economic point of view, but also from a non-economic point of view. We have invited two reputed speakers to help us better understand this issue, and I'm going to introduce them to you. It's two academics, but at the same time, these two experts have different sort of backgrounds and are also two people that play a very important role on the Italian and international scenarios. They're both economists. We have on the one hand Tommaso Nannicini, who is also now directly involved in the world of politics, and then we have Carlo Cottarelli, who historically may be defined as a sort of a specialist, a so-called technician, but recently, as you all know, has decided to play a quite important role in the political life of the country. Well, I'd like to seize this opportunity to personally thank the style, balance and personality showed by Carlo, and say thank you very much indeed. Before starting, I'd like to make a brief preliminary introduction on the backgrounds of our two guests. Carlo Cottarelli is the director of the Observatory on the Italian Public Accounts of the Catholic University of Milan, and this is something he does pro bono. He's also a visiting professor at Bocconi University in Milan. From 81 to 87, he worked for the Bank of Italy, and from 87 to 88 for Eni, and then in 88 he started working for the International Monetary Fund, and at the IMF he was director of the Fiscal Affairs Department until 2013, and then from 2014 until 2017 he was executive director for Italy, Albania, Greece, Malta, Portugal and San Marino. Between October 2013 and October 2014 he was an auditor for the spending review in Italy. Then we have Tommaso Nannicini, full professor of political economics at Bocconi University in Milan. He also taught at several important international universities, including Harvard, just to name but a few. He's an internationally renowned speaker, highly esteemed. In 2015, he won consolidated grant by the European Research Council that is very important at European level. Since a very young age, he made his scientific passion go hand in hand with his political passion. And then in September 2014, this passion led him being appointed as economic counselor of former Prime Minister Renzi, and then he was Undersecretary of the Presidency of the Council of Ministers with the specific competence for social and scientific policies, and he is now part of the Secretary of the Democratic Party since 2017, and in 2018 he was appointed as Senator of the Democratic Party. He is also a member of the specific committee on employment. I would like to start by thanking once again our two reputed speakers. We decided together to structure the conference in the following way. So I will ask some questions to the two speakers, and so they will answer little by little. So I will start with Tommaso. So I would like to know the connection between the meeting's title and this conference title. So just the forces that move history at the same time to make men happy, and so how to save resources for the development. So on the one hand, we have happiness as a major topic and development on the other hand. So which is the connection between these two major topics? What's your opinion also in relation to your personal experience? Also considering the way, for instance, the United Nations are considering this. With the Millennium Development Goals, they have set the future development for 2015, and now with the Agenda 2030, they have set 17 sustainable development goals to be achieved by 2030. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I would like to start from the end of your question. So, the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has a great merit because, in particular, these goals are very clear when it comes to sustainable development from an environmental point of view, but also when it comes to fighting against inequalities. I'm not a big fan of quantitative goals enshrined in international treaties or written documents, because very often those papers just, do not bring about real concrete results. So you have a lot of technical committees meeting and discussing, and then nothing is then being done. So sometimes agenda settings and goal settings are very good opportunities simply for doing nothing or just spend time discussing and reflecting. But in this case, I think that this is something different, because the 2030 agenda set by the UN is very important because it sets the right track to be followed. So development that should be sustainable not only in relation to the constraints and boundaries that we may encounter when it comes to the environment and the natural resources, but specifically a big emphasis is put on the dimensionality of these sustainable development, from education to educational investments, investments in human capital, fight against social inequality. So it's a new paradigm that is set forth by the UN. And as Marcia said, this is an agenda that very much people's capabilities oriented. So it's not just about redistributing income and sort of wealth, that is absolutely important to fight against poverty, but on the other hand, strengthening capabilities and skills of people is the other key pillar. And it is very important also to favor the development of safe communities. So getting a decent pay for decent work is absolutely important to have inclusive and wealthy and sustainable societies. I think this is the right approach, especially if we consider, the future economic development perspectives to have inclusive development. We need to have a look at education, fight against social inequalities, human capital, and so on and so forth. But then we need to just make all this come true, because there was a recent reform of the finance law that now includes these indicators about investment, human capital, educational poverty, impact on environmental resources, and so that now the people making these financial laws need to consider not only the decisions to be made, but also the impact of those decisions on all these indicators. But the real risk is that even this reform of the financial law will simply remain a bureaucratic exercise, so that during the very last night before voting the law, and then you have to make specific amendments to be passed and approved. Maybe you just put some bureaucrats into a room and sort of they are somehow told to make things work when it comes to these indicators. But then we should consider these indicators as beacons to be followed in order to really direct our future policies. And this is something that should also be known by the civic society, because the more the society is informed about that, the more we can hope that, politicians will remember the importance of the impact of these choices on the indicators themselves. So, I will now move on to another topic that makes the connection between the meeting's title and this conference title, because the concept of sustainability per se links up with the idea of limit, of constraint. So if the wish of happiness of individuals is what connects these sorts of impulse towards the forces to make the move history, we can do nothing but consider the sense of limit, because we always need to consider the limits of such a will. So to me, constraints are just opportunities, because they define the room within I can really express my sort of potential, so that we can reach altogether common ground. I think that the sense of constraint and of limit are key in order to pursue common good and conquer spaces of individual freedom. But in order to turn constraint into opportunities, you need to get to know them. You cannot ignore them. You cannot put them aside. You cannot sort of make fun with the history of man, because in order to turn constraints into opportunities, you need really to know them rather well. Well, I remember a friend of mine who was a manager at a company that had to sponsor motorbike Grand Prix, and they had to choose which motorbike pilot to choose to support. And it was a young that was identified as a very promising one, but this one he said, well, he keeps falling all the time, and he said he's not falling because he's not good, but really because he's trying to get to know his limits. And to know your limits, you need to try to reach them. It's the only way to overcome them. Because if you make the ostrich and you just pretend that, there are no limits and you don't worry about them, you just pretend constraints do not exist. Well, that does not mean that you can better solve problems, that you have no magic wand. On the contrary, you become a slave or you're constrained simply because you do not know them. Thank you very much, Tommaso, for this first part of answer. But we're going to go back to you in a second. But Carlo, what's your take on development? What's your vision and your attitude also according to your experience at the IMF? So first of all, thanks for inviting me and for being here. So this is a rather important topic because sustainable development is crucial. Well, a first remark that I would like to make as Italian is that first of all, we need to guarantee the traditionally defined development because unfortunately the tragic problem of Italian economy is that we haven't been growing for the last 20 years. The same per capita average income is the same that we have today, is the same that we had 20 years ago. So this is a big issue. So that's why we need to relaunch the GDP growth process. So the GDP is nothing but the total sum of all the incomes of the Italians. So we need to make it grow once again, and maybe we can see together how we can sort of boost these growth of our income in a more traditional way, so according to the way the GDP is measured. But also, I totally agree with you. I mean, sustainability of growth is as important as the growth itself. So first we need to guarantee growth and then to make it sustainable. And well, I always to put my macroeconomist expert hat first on. So growth needs to be sustainable from a macroeconomic point of view, first of all. We have seen in the past and also in a more recent past the cases like Turkey, so countries that grew a lot all of a sudden, but then sort of somehow just have a rather sort of shocking moment and have to confront with their own limits. We would like to have a more stable growth, maybe have a sort of smaller growth that it's sustainable in the long run. And then there are some specific elements of stability that go beyond macroeconomics. And Tommaso in particular has already mentioned some of these elements, so I do apologize for repeating them. For instance, the specific planet-related constraints, because you know that there are ties about our production, because we are literally consuming the planet, so we should try to make our impact on the planet as little as possible. So we should try to guarantee sustainable growth so that, we will leave something for future generations. Otherwise, we will consume everything that is available. Then there is another major issue relating to income distribution. The IMF over the last few years has produced several studies showing that an unfair growth where income distribution is not equally sort of distributed. So you have growth that involves only from 1 to 10% of the Earth's population is not sustainable at all. This is what may trigger crisis, or that can even reduce the average of the growth rate over the years. Unfortunately, industrialized countries are not going very well because over the last few years we have seen an income distribution oriented toward other countries, and so for now this kind of growth seems to be concentrated in specific areas of the world, and income distribution has shifted from the ages on more and more within each country, so including advanced countries, towards in a sort of unbalanced situation. And then there is a third aspect, that has to do with distribution equality, but this is a different kind of distribution. I talked about sort of the unfair distribution of wealth, because rich people become more and more rich, and so society at large is sort of responsible for that. But there is another element that maybe is even more important. It's the equality when it comes to opportunities, because of course the results then depend on people's abilities, but we should sort of have starting equal opportunities. And I think that this is a key concept that has never ever been developed enough in Italy, in my opinion. The so-called social lift in our country doesn't work. So what is the social lift? I mean, you can climb the social ladder and get to a better position compared with the position you were born with. And Fubini recently published a very nice book illustrating the consequences of this lack of a so-called social elevator, allowing people to improve their socio-economic condition. And so we should try to do our best so that these social elevator could start or restart. And I think this is essential when it comes to sustainability. This is an essential element, in particular, not only to make sort of economy sustainable and development sustainable, but to make our society sustainable. Because a society where nobody can improve, but of course it's a society doomed to sort of misbehavior. Because if people see that complying with the rules doesn't bring about the expected results, well, then those people will somehow will try to dodge rules and regulations. So again, this is something that can seriously undermine the functioning of any economy and also of society. So I was just about to stop you because I would like to ask you a second question. So let's talk about Italy. We have talked about so the concept of development that we want to rely on. You have already made a couple of references to Italy, but let's talk about Italy. Which are the major constraints to development in this country? You have recently published a book about the 7 capital sins of Italy. Why is it so that Italy does not grow? Over the last 20 years, we haven't had any growth, not at all, unlike other countries of the world, and also unlike other European countries. Well, the Euro experience was not very well sort of experienced in our country for several reasons. And in particular, over the last 20 years, we lost competitiveness. So investors find it better to invest elsewhere than in Italy because, well, the sort of sentiment for investments is not good in Italy. Too high cost, too many barriers, and so on. And moreover, there is a certain frailty of our public expense because we have the second highest Eurozone sort of debt. Well, Greece was worse than us, but the debt of Greece is substantially held by the other European countries, is not held by financial markets, not by those who each month decide whether or not to reinvest in sort of state equity and bonds. So this is different because we may encounter a sort of trust crisis from the market, and so that would pose a big threat on us. So we have a major public finance problem. But let's go back to competitiveness and productivity of Italy. Unfortunately, we are tied by many and several issues that were born a long time ago. I'm talking about the tax dodging, I'm talking about corruption, I'm talking about too much bureaucracy, I'm talking about sort of public justice being too slow, I talk about the demographic breakdown. That is one of the major issues, and also the difference between the North and the South. So the big gap that exists between the North and the South. So these are the major sins of Italy. But I just want to emphasize the important role in negative terms played by one of these sins, because it really hinders the growth of Italy. And at the same time, politically, it could be fixed because you would not need public funds to do so, because our public funds are rather negative. I'm talking about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a major obstacle. We have learned to sort of live with bureaucracy, to cope with it. And I've been for quite some time in the US, and the US is a much less bureaucratized country than Italy. And when you stay abroad and go back to Italy, you immediately perceive this high burden of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy costs a huge amount of money to Italian businesses, and we can see it every day as citizens, but it costs even more to entrepreneurs. So it's a major obstacle to investments. So the simple fact of filling in forms is enormous. It's more than 30 billion per year for small and medium-sized enterprises. And I talked to people who told me, I have 100 workers that carry out the production, and then I have another 20 people that in one office, they just fill in forms for bureaucratic needs. So we really need to make a change when it comes to bureaucracy. We should have a reform, but so far this reform has not taken place. And then bureaucracy doesn't only mean sort of costs and sort of complicated procedures, but that also means sort of slow times, because the former owner of Grom Ice Parlors told me that, for instance, it took him 1 year to open his ice parlors in Japan, and it took him 7 years to open them in Rome. So that doesn't work. It's not okay. I mean, Italy should be considered by investors as a place to invest, and not the other way around. On the contrary, if you ask investors why they do not invest in Italy, essentially there are 3 key points. First of all, the level of taxation, and you reduce it, you should do it in a credible way, so reducing the level of expenses. So we can talk about that when it comes to finding resources for development. And secondly, bureaucracy. And the third point is the justice being too slow, and then there is tax dodging, there is corruption. But these are the top priorities on which the state should work on in order to relaunch the European project, to take away these obstacles to growth. And last but not least, we need to invest in capital, but not only capital, because of course I know that we should invest in infrastructure, and the general facts prove it clearly. But then we should also invest in education and building, in public resources and human resources. This is key for the future of our country. Thank you very much, Carlo.
Tommaso.
So, Tommaso, Carlo has just introduced the 7 capital sins of the Italian economy. So tax evasion, corruption, too much bureaucracy, slow justice, slow trials, the demographic collapse, etc. So you've also been interested in this topic, which refers to the restrictions. So in your opinion, what are the key restrictions blocking, hindering the development for Italy? I agree with Carlo Cottarelli when it comes to the fact that we need to find out the sparks for this growth, which we've been losing for the past decades. I'm referring to the period of economic crisis, which hit our companies and our families very bad. it reduced the ability to make savings on the part of the Italian families. But in that period, I used to say that we should not focus only on the economic crisis as it were something coming from other countries, although it was partly so. But while for other countries growth resumed after the crisis ended, in Italy, the situation is different because we are experiencing a stagnation of the growth and of the consumption. So we have structural restrictions, structural burdens to growth, and we were the culprits for those structural restrictions. So we should get rid of these limitations, of these restrictions. Otherwise, we will not be able to grow again. As for the limits, as for the restrictions, I've dealt with the relationship between the policymakers and the intellectuals, because this is an important topic when it comes to the way to make political decisions. Italy is experiencing of a schizophrenia when it comes to policy and the real situation. Many Italians are convinced that politicians and policymakers are far away from the real situation of everyday of Italians, but Italians at the same time tend to wait for the response here and now, for an immediate response to all their problems. So this situation means that we've lost the sense of the ties, of the restrictions. As for the situation I was mentioning earlier, that was mentioned by the Pope Emeritus, and I will read it briefly. I will read briefly what he said about this situation. The policy has changed, and it has become, due to various causes, especially the lack of far-sightedness on the part of policy makers, policy has stopped being the builder of what is possible. It has become a supermarket of the impossible things. As Ratzinger wrote, being sober means doing what is possible and not claiming what is not possible. This has always been difficult. The voice of reason is never as strong as the cry of the irrational, the cry leading things to the moralism. Limiting yourself to what is possible seems to be the pragmatism of those who are not bold enough, but in reality, policy means resisting the temptation and the seduction of the big words which are used to make fun of the men and of the possibilities. The compromise is a real moral of the political activity. So the topic of ties, so resisting the temptation, the seduction of the big words with which you can make fun of the dignity of man, means that you need to focus on the ways to help a process for growth and development, bearing in mind the ties and the bonds without hiding them. Public debt, of course, is the most evident of the restrictions that we have in Italy. But public debt is not something which has come all of a sudden. It is the result of several decisions that have become sort of a sediment of the Italian economy. Somebody is now promising that we can get rid of this restriction by simply printing money, printing banknotes, but that's not the way to go. There are restrictions which have nothing to do with monetary sovereignty. If we look at the history of our Italian public debt, before the explosion of the gross domestic product, this situation is due to several wrong choices that were made in the past. For instance, related to the social security, the welfare system, and these wrong decisions were taken far before the economic crisis. Let's have a look at the situation in the 1965-1970s. 10 points of from 1965 to 1975, there was an increase by 10% of the GDP, and the same situation was also experienced by other European countries, but the expense in other countries increased. In Italy, unlike other countries, the taxation remained at 30%, because in Italy, the policymakers hoped to gain consensus by distributing benefits and by spending money. And the costs were hidden, but the restrictions were there. They were monetized by the tax on the inflation. Then after 1981, when the Treasury Ministry was separated from the Bank of Italy, and it was no longer possible to print banknotes, and then there was an explosion of the ratio between the debt, the public debt, and the GDP. But that was a result of several choices made several decades earlier. But we need to come to terms with compatibility when it comes to choices. I'm referring to responsibility towards those who then have to bear the burdens and the costs for the wrong choices, and those who bear the costs are the weakest members of the society. Restrictions not only refer to financial restrictions when it comes to economic policy. Well, debt in Italy is a real burden vis-à-vis several leverages that may be used, but we also have restrictions linked to the demographic situation of Italy and to other factors, and we need to make changes in this respect if we are to change the situation. And the restrictions are closely linked to the choices that have to be made, because all these elements are tied and connected to one another. Thank you very much, Tommaso. Well, your point was very interesting. So we've talked about the view and the conception of development. We've talked about restrictions for development in Italy. Let's talk about resources a bit. Which kind of resources what are the current resources available for the development in Italy? Well, earlier you talked about investments. We do need investments, of course, in Italy, and attractive investments is important as creating positive circuits in order to increase job creation and productivity. We need investments when it comes to infrastructure, but in addition to economic capital, physical capital, and infrastructural capital, I think that most of the restrictions to the capability of Italy to grow have to do with the institutional and human capital. We should not forget about these two factors, which are key factors for growth. There are many, there is an important literature, many papers on these two factors. Human capital is important when it comes to providing new opportunities for development and sustainable development for a country. When I talk about institutional capital, I am referring to effective institutions which are called upon to respond and to be responsible for their choices. So you should have clear in your mind that you're responsible for the choices you make. You should not simply blame others for the mistakes you've made. And you should not find the culprit on Twitter or on Facebook. So the complexity when it comes to institutions and the scarce quality of our policy organization leads to the lack of responsibility, the lack of willingness to take on responsibility. And it means for citizens to have a weapon when it comes to voting, which is not suitable. It means not having an institutional and political organization which is able to make far-sighted choices, where by which in the short term you may have costs to incur, but you in the end in the long term you have benefits. And in this way, you as a politician can manage to communicate these choices to the voters. The fact that in Italy no reform has ever been carried out in order to eliminate the improper burdens on the labor costs means that all the decision makers were not far-sighted, because these choices can have repercussions. So restructuring the public machine means carrying out an overall reorganization. If we think about the manager of a private company, who is called upon to make changes to improve the situation of a company without having a say and without being allowed to touch the very key factor, which is the human capital. But these choices have a repercussion on our capability to create growth. But we need to have policy makers who have the courage to bear the burden of their choices. So you've started talking about capitals, and you are focusing on the relationship between the human capital and the institutional capital. This is linked to my recent activity. So when it comes to these capitals, social capital, infrastructural capital, human capital, environmental capital, up to the economic capital, institutional capital, why do you consider this connection so important today? Why is the connection between institutional and human capital so important? I will try and conclude my contribution. I've started from there because I still think that vis-à-vis France, Germany, well, I think that that is one of the biggest burdens that we are carrying. I'm referring to the quality of our institutions. As for the social capital, that's also an important topic, but it is a long-lasting kind of topic. It has a lot to do with the intermediate bodies, on how you can create a common sense of the community. These are, thorny issues, but I believe that the human capital has to do with the development, and this is a factor on which we should invest more. Let's think about the welfare system in Italy. The first obsession of the welfare state at the beginning of the 20th century was to provide a guarantee for an income from the cradle to the tomb, to the grave. But I think that we should come to terms with the technological advancement which changes the relationships between the people and the enterprises and and I think that education and training should be the core of the activities from the cradle to the grave, rather than the guarantee of an income, of a fixed income, because we need to think in a different way. In the 19th century, we had a different kind of life cycle. You studied, then you got a job, and then you worked, and then you retired, and then you died. In our society now, current society, we all need to carry out a constant learning process, and so we should focus on training and education. This should be the focus of all the trajectory from the cradle to the grave. And I think this should be the greatest change of way of thinking that we are called upon to be confronted with, and we should start from here in order to get rid of some of the burdens we are being carrying. So you worked in the Monetary Fund when it comes to the topic of these resources. You worked for 30 years on this topic. So what would you like to add when it comes to what Tommaso has just said? Well, starting from one of Tommaso's remarks, I agree on the fact that, first of all, we need political resources. So we need rulers who are bold enough to have a far-sighted vision, a long-term vision, because some of these reforms do entail costs of various kinds for parts of the society. But we also need, when it comes to financial resources, as I said, in order to make Italy a place where it is easier to invest, we probably need at present to lower the burden of taxation on labor, which is very high in Italy. I said that there's a need to strengthen taxation, and then we also need to strengthen the public finances in Italy so that the debt can be reduced. And for this to be carried out, we need resources, we need financial resources. And then education. When it comes to education, I had a task to review. I was in charge of a spending review for 1 year. I made several suggestions to make savings in several expenses, with two exceptions. One is education, and the other one is a fourth point, namely infrastructure. Then I will focus briefly on the possible origins, possible sources for the resources, but I would like to mention something more when it comes to these 2 points. Before coming back to Italy, when I was working for the Monetary Fund, my department had carried out studies which showed that the first form of public expenditure which is linked to economic growth is education before infrastructure. Then when I came back, I came to Italy, I worked as a person in charge of the spending review. I made a comparison between Italy and other European countries, and I made these comparisons appropriately, in the most proper way. Somebody said Italy spends 2% of the GDP for this area. In Europe, they spend 2% of the GDP. We are in line. No, we need to bear in mind that we have stronger and more stringent restrictions on our budget, on our capability to spend. So making a comparison with other countries, bearing in mind the restrictions that we have because of our public debt, what is shown is that we have a sector in which Italy does not spend enough money, and that's education. So on the basis of the work I've carried out in the Monetary Fund and in my year as a person in charge of the spending review, I can say that the sector of education is a sector which needs further more resources. And so linking my remarks to the previous elements, I would also like to add that we need to invest more in education in all over Italy, not only in northern regions. As for infrastructure, infrastructure is an important topic, and I would like to underline one thing. What matters is not simply the amount of expenditure for infrastructure. Despite all the cuts that have been carried out when it comes to fixed investments by the public sector, we spend as much as Germany spends. But our problem in Italy is that we historically had a low quality when it comes to the expenditure. We need to learn how to spend better. And this has a lot to do with problems related to corruption, which still exist in the sector of public works. We need to learn how to spend better. We need to learn how to spend more rapidly. We need to learn how to use the European funds available for infrastructure. And more importantly, this is more important than the amount of money spent, but it is also necessary to find resources for infrastructure. So we need resources to try and reduce taxation, to reduce our public debt, to strengthen education, and to strengthen infrastructure. Where do we get these resources? Where can these resources come from? We cannot believe in the illusion that we can simply print banknotes. That's not the way to go. This is not the solution to the problem of resource creation. So within the framework of Italian public accounts, we need to make an in-depth analysis. Where can we save? We can make lots of savings, and I could talk for weeks on the basis of the work I've carried out in my year as the person in charge of spending review. When it comes to public expenditure, net of interest, this is made of three things: the procurement, so the purchases on the part of the public sector, the uniforms for the armed forces, the computers, weapons, vehicles, and purchases for investment. So the state as a purchaser. Then we have the expenditure for civil servants. So state as the employer. The first item is about 150 billion euros. The second item is 160 billion. So the wages paid to the civil servants. But then we have transfers. So the checks for families and for companies. So where can we make some savings in these three mega areas? As for the expenditure for goods and services, you need to learn how to buy spending less. So finding the lowest prices. And this is the only sector, the only part in which some progress, some advance is being made. So, a lot more could be done. Then secondly, purchases are made by prices and amounts and quantities. So you should try and avoid buying things which are useless. And this has to do with the entire organization of the state. We should avoid having two entities doing exactly the same thing and thereby consuming the double the amount for the natural gas, for electricity, etc. So we should close all the necessary offices. This is a long-term proposal, and it has a cost. If I say we need to close, to shut down a useless entity, I make savings in terms of electricity, and I also make savings in terms of the excessive amount of employees, and then I need to deal with this topic. When it comes to the expenditure for the wages of the civil servants, you need to multiply the the wages, the per capita wages, for the number of employees. 10 years ago, the wages of public servants were too high vis-à-vis the wages of people working for the private sector. We have reached a level which is more or less the same as the one of the rest of Europe. We still have a problem when it comes to the executives, especially those working in the ministries. They have wages which are too high in comparison with those of their colleagues in other European countries. And then we have another topic, that of the quantity, of the amount of civil servants. I believe that we could further reduce the number of people working for the public sector, of course, in several sectors, not everywhere. Or we can try and have the same amount of civil servants, but the current civil servants should be assigned tasks which are normally outsourced. I'll give you an example. The security services in many courts are provided by private companies, and the state pays for guardians, armed guardians, and the same service could be carried out by policemen. So the first item, the state as a purchaser, well, that could be a way of making savings. I know it's difficult, and it is even more difficult from a political point of view. It is not technically difficult. These things are technically difficult because it is difficult to restructure the offices of the state. But then, as for the third item, the state paying checks and transferring money, well, technically that's easy. That's an easy task. All you need to do is to change a law. So this gentleman here receives a check every month, and I, as a state, can do something so that this gentleman no longer receives the checks. Politically, this is very difficult. All these aspects have been dealt with and have become unpopular because I always talk about these topics. And I always say that we should not neglect the costs for the pensions. The state pays about 400 billion euros to families and companies, and 330 billion are for companies, and the rest is expenditure for the pensions. So we should we should analyze all the pensions which are being paid. So those who receive a pension amount which is excessive vis-a-vis all the contributions paid, well, should receive less money. So I made my recommendations when I was in charge of the spending review. And then there are transfers from the state to a whole set of private or almost private entities, which I think should be reconsidered. It is very complex. When it comes to the Observatory on Italian public accounts, in September we will publish another analysis on the transfers from the state to the companies. Not only manufacturing companies, we deal with the papers, we deal with the entities dealing with horse races, transportation by trucks, and this is valid in general for the transfers. The fundamental criterion is that the state is giving the fundamental question is this: is the state really paying somebody or some entity which really needs money or not? So we need to have a sort of a protection net for those who are in real difficulties. So the question is, are we really giving money to those who really need, who really have difficulties, or are we giving money to entities or to people not needing money? Of course, these people will certainly complain because they feel they are entitled to an income, but they will continue doing the same things without the subsidies, without the state subsidies. It means that they do not need them. So this also has to do with another enormous area. It is similar to the transfer. I'm referring to the so-called the tax expenditures, so the subsidies, the benefits, deductions, which are partly justified, but which are also partly difficult to be justified. And over the years, they've been increasing because at every budget, there's somebody deciding to introduce a new benefit every year. I will give you an example. It is something I've personally experienced this year. Since I've moved to Milan, I bought I bought a subscription for the local public transport in Lombardy. For 1 year, I paid less than 300 euros. This is a subsidy which is given to me, Carlo Cottarelli, and I could afford, of course, to pay a lot more for local transport, for local public transport. I would do it, and I would be more than willing to do it, because if I use a local transport, I use it because it is more uncomfortable for me to travel by taxi. But that's a subsidy which is given to me. And then this year, when I paid for the subscription for the public transport in Milan, I was said that thanks to the a rule of the past law, I can receive 50 or 60 euros back from the state. I will not make any application for these 50 to 60 euros in return, because I have a very good wage, so I don't need this 50 or 60 euros, but I'm sure that many people will certainly make an application for it. We should all know that the Italian public transport receives subsidies from the state, and the subsidies are given also to all the people who could afford to pay more for public transport. So we should all be aware of the fact that in many cases the money we receive from the state are not necessary for us, and they could be spent for other sectors, for instance for education, to improve education. These are the things we should do if we are to restart growing again. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Carlo, for giving us such a complete answer, and somehow you have already answered to my third and fourth question. So Carlo in particular focused on the spending review. So Tommaso, which are, the best strategies for Italian development, your opinion? So according to your own experience, of course, how can we make the most of capitals? When it comes to subsidiarity culture, a culture we really like as a country, could be useful and helpful when it comes to defining new future development strategies for our country? Well, I do agree with what has been said about quantity and qualities of expenditure. And I think that the major problem of this country is that money have been spent in a bad way. It's not that it was spent too much or too little. So really, I really don't want to dwell on that. It's nonsensical now. But now, from now on, let's try to spend public money better. Let's imagine that I have 5 billion available, and I have to decide whether I want to invest this money to maybe sort of reduce the burden of pensions, and maybe sort of define new ways also to support these people who carried out very sort of hard and heavy jobs and have to retire earlier. And so you understand very well that if the actuary equality cannot be complied with because resources are not enough, I should use then that money to sort of develop in a better way education and training. So I should consider things in a very long term. And of course, any decision of this kind depends on choices. It's all about choices. Choices need to be made rationally, carefully, wisely, and in a transparent way. So again, decisions do not come out of the blue. So politicians should try really to consider the long run and try to invest in the long run in sort of social buffers on the one hand, but also on the other hand in training and education, in order also to avoid then too many sort of retired people of a certain kind. So again, you really need to plan ahead as much as possible, somehow to guide the development in the direction you want. And again, when it comes to public expenditure and auditing of public expenditure, everything is always seen in a spending review sort of optics, and this is okay. But again, this is also about reviewing priorities and seeing where it is best to invest. For instance, I still remember my first encounter with politics. I remember I was 6 years old, and a schoolmate told me, "Oh, your father is so mean." It was a counselor, a local counselor, and he said, "Oh, your dad wants to close the hospital." Actually, there was a project of reform. Again, it's also about reforming the services. And sometimes, if we have a look at that, we see that, it's not just a matter of cost. So longer run policies should go beyond policies relying on no's or on cuts. You need to somehow take up challenges and run specific risks, talk with the civil society, and build really wise, aware, and consent long-term decisions. So spending review is very important because this is about making the priorities. So priority setting is very, very important, especially when it comes to communities. And so politicians should be made accountable for these choices without sort of then finding justifications, but simply totally acknowledging the choices made. Tommaso, so we are getting to the end of our meeting, of our conference, sorry. So a last very quick question. So our youngsters, so our young people who already come into this world with a heavy debt burden, and again, why should we be optimistic about the future of Italy? Please give us some reasons, so especially for our young people. So a word for our youngsters. Tommaso, I start with you. Oh yes, I wrote an essay in 2011 about the optimism people should have about Italy. I'm still animated by that optimism, even if years have passed. And when it comes to the sort of intergenerational sort of relationship, okay, this is something that had a major impact on the so-called intergenerational equality. And I'm thinking about not just very, very young, but another generation, people who are young but not that young any longer, those that are in between and that were somehow squeezed between distributional policies that seemed to reward other categories, and then found itself over the 90s with the first spending reviews and then a major opportunity reduction. And so probably this in-between generation has been the major victim of all of these sort of twists and turns of our policies. And unfortunately, this generation is still trying to find its way, especially in the job market. Well, my home take message is an optimistic one, and hope is a risk worth taking. It's hard to talk about investments without talking about risks. The biggest limit of some public policies is that some generations were deprived from the right to dream, the right to sort of have expectations. People should know that if you work enough hard, if you commit enough, you can reach whenever you want, regardless of your social and family background, regardless of your sort of origin, and so on. So the idea was to disseminate a sort of universal welfare models likely to support anybody. Again, these limits should be turned into something that encourages people to take and run risks, trying to lay the foundations of a general welfare system available to all. And that's how we should proceed. So trying to strengthen such a system, letting anybody try to follow their dreams, because this is really what is all about. So hope is a risk worth taking. So, as to the public debt, first of all, I would like to remark one thing. 70% more or less of our public debt actually is held by Italians. So, literally, our youngsters inherit of the debt part, but also of the credit part. But again, this is the first thing to be considered. And the negative legacy we leave to our children is the fact that they will have to make very difficult choices, because when new generation are being given a very high level of debt, that means that the previous generation was not able to make the right choices. And so then our children have and will still have to do much more daring than us and maybe do very harsh things. So we should be more responsible and let us take up this responsibility and not let us others take it. So far, our youngsters have been disadvantaged by the crisis. Over the last 10 years, the younger generations paid a very high price for the crisis, certainly more than the elderly. I know that this does not sound popular. If you have a look at the income, you may see that the income distribution is now in favor of the elderly. And it's not because the elderly have become rich over the last few years, but somehow they have been more protected than young people from the effects of the economic crisis that started between 2007, 2008, and 9, and then got deeper in 2011 and 2012. Again, this is something to be considered, and the Tortuga group, a group of young students working with me at Bocconi University, is about to publish a study that talks about the so-called new poor that are so much common among young people, much more than older people. So young people count less because there are fewer young people. We have a new cohort of 500,000 people per year. The new cohort used to be of 1 million people. So again, it's much easier to do something for the elderly because they are more numerous, much more than youngsters. But if you really want to take care of the future of our country, as parents, as grandparents, we need to take care of them. And even if young people are not as many as old people, they need to be considered as important with better education and also trying to sort of treat them differently because the construction of social capital starts from the school but also from the family. I think that I do believe in specific things because my mother taught me that, or because my daddy taught me that, okay? So we need to take full responsibility of these sort of social construction work of social generations. And again, this is a political slogan, the one that I'm about to utter. Well, many people talked about a so-called basic income as a measure in favor of young unemployed people from the south of Italy. And I think that this sort of minimum social salary, I think that actually young people should have a real opportunity of being part and parcel of this society as citizens. So thank you very much to Carlo and Tommaso. I don't want to add anything else, just a last remark to thank you once again, because I think that your words shed a lot of light on very important topics, and also you showed us to what extent it is important and possible to have a quite balanced and clear vision of what to do. Thank you very much for outlining these possible future strategies for the development of our country. Thank you very much again for staying and being with us. Thank you.